You have 30 days to vacate, old man, or we take it in a foreclosure auction. Deborah snapped, waving a folder in my grandfather's face. I froze in the doorway, groceries still in my hands, watching the woman who called herself our HOA president threaten a 78-year-old farmer. Grandpa didn't flinch. He just smiled, and that smile terrified Deborah more than any lawsuit ever could. My name is Casey Reyes, and this is the story of how a small-town HOA queen tried to steal my grandfather's land and lost everything. 6 months earlier, life was simple. Grandpa's farm sat on the edge of Millbrook Estates, a plot he'd owned since before the subdivision existed. He grew tomatoes, kept 3 goats, and waved at every jogger who passed his fence line each morning. Deborah Halloway moved into Millbrook 2 years ago, bought the biggest house, and within 6 months, ran unopposed for HOA president. She wasn't just controlling. She was surgical about it, memorizing every bylaw like a weapon she planned to use eventually. Grandpa's farm predated the HOA. He wasn't even technically a member, but Deborah insisted the annexation clause applied to him. Legal loophole, she called it, flashing a smug grin at the last community meeting. Nobody dared question her. I just moved back home after my divorce, staying in the guest room to help Grandpa with the farm and, honestly, to heal. The first sign of trouble was a citation taped to the barn door. Unauthorized agricultural structure. 5-day compliance notice. Grandpa laughed it off. That barn's older than her house, he said, tossing the paper into a drawer he called his Deborah file. I didn't laugh. Something about her name on that letterhead made my stomach twist. 2 weeks later, a second citation arrived, this one for livestock in violation of residential aesthetic standards. The goats apparently were an eyesore. Deborah's own words, printed in bold at the bottom of the notice. Grandpa had owned goats since I was a kid. They'd never bothered a soul except the coyotes they scared off. I started keeping copies. Every letter, every photo, every date. Call it instinct, call it knowing a bully when I saw one. At the next HOA meeting, Grandpa stood up calmly and asked which bylaw governed pre-existing farmland. Deborah smiled that same practiced smile. The board will review it, she said, which everyone in that room knew meant nothing. Walking out, an older neighbor, Mr. Osei, whispered, "She did this to the Chapmans last year. They moved before anyone noticed." That was the first thread. I started asking around, quietly, about the Chapmans and anyone else Deborah had helped along. Turns out 3 families had left Millbrook in 2 years, each after a wave of citations no one else seemed to get. I didn't say anything to Grandpa yet. I just kept a notebook, dates on one side, names on the other. The citations kept coming. Fence height, mailbox color, even the flag he flew every 4th of July. Each fine was small, $50 here, $100 there, but they added up and Grandpa refused to let me pay them for him. "It's the principle," he'd say, stacking the notices in a shoebox like trophies he never asked for. Then came the letter that changed everything. A notice claiming the farm's fence encroached 3 feet onto community common area. 3 feet that, according to the original county survey from 1962, had always belonged to my grandfather. I drove to the county records office myself and pulled the original deed. The line was clear. Deborah was wrong or lying. When I showed Grandpa the deed, he just nodded slowly. "She's not going to stop at 3 feet, Casey. She wants the whole thing." I didn't understand what he meant yet. I thought he was being paranoid. I was wrong. A week later, Deborah showed up at our gate personally, clipboard in hand, a photographer trailing behind her. "Just documenting violations for the board," she said sweetly, snapping photos of the goats, the barn, even Grandpa's truck. Grandpa invited her in for lemonade. She declined so fast you'd think he'd offered her poison. That night, I found something odd while digging through the HOA's public filings online. Deborah had petitioned the board twice to rezone underutilized parcels. Underutilized parcels. Grandpa's 15 acres sat right in the middle of the description, though his name was never mentioned directly. I printed the filing and taped it inside my notebook. The pattern was forming, and it wasn't subtle anymore. Rumor around town said a developer had been sniffing around Millbrook, offering big money for land near the new highway extension. Grandpa's farm sat exactly on that stretch. Suddenly, every citation made a sickening kind of sense. I asked Grandpa outright, "Has anyone approached you about selling?" He shook his head, but his jaw tightened. "Man came by in a suit last spring," he admitted finally. "Offered half what the land's worth." I told him no. That man, it turned out, worked for a firm called Holloway and Cross Development, Deborah's husband's company. The pieces clicked into place like a lock finally turning. This was never about fences or goats. It was about land and money and greed. I started recording every meeting on my phone, legally, since our state allowed one-party consent. Deborah never suspected the quiet granddaughter in the back row was building a case against her one word at a time. The fines escalated to threats of liens. A lien on land that had been in our family for 3 generations. Grandpa's hands shook reading that letter, the only time I ever saw him truly scared. "They can't take land that's rightfully mine," he said, though his voice cracked on the word can't. I hugged him and made a promise I intended to keep. "They will not take this farm. Not while I'm breathing." I called an old college friend, now a real estate attorney, and laid out everything, the deed, the filings, the pattern of harassment. She went quiet on the phone, then said, "Casey, if even half of this is provable, Deborah is in serious trouble." We needed more than suspicion. We needed a paper trail so tight even Deborah's slick lawyers couldn't wriggle out. I began FOIA requests on HOA board minutes, financial records, and any communication mentioning Parcel 14, Grandpa's farm. It took 3 weeks and 2 appeals, but the documents finally arrived in a thick manila envelope. Buried on page 42 was an email. Deborah to her husband. "Almost got the old man to fold. Keep pressure on." My hands trembled holding that printout. It was real. It was proof. It was everything. I didn't celebrate yet. Grandpa always said, "Never show your cards before the dealer does." Instead, I kept collecting every citation, every photo, every email, building a folder thick enough to bury her. The lien notice arrived on a Tuesday. Deborah had convinced the board to file it, claiming unpaid community assessments. Grandpa had never owed a dime in assessments. He wasn't even a legal HOA member. The lien was fabricated. That was the line she shouldn't have crossed. Fabricating a legal document wasn't a bylaw dispute. It was fraud. My attorney friend confirmed it. Filing a false lien was a criminal offense, not just a civil matter. We had her. Or at least we had enough to make her very afraid, if we played it right. Deborah, sensing resistance, doubled down instead of backing off. Big mistake. Karens rarely know when to stop. She scheduled an emergency board vote to expedite foreclosure proceedings on the fraudulent lien, giving Grandpa 10 days to respond. 10 days to save a farm that had survived 3 recessions, 2 droughts, and 1 very determined grandmother, long gone now. I told Grandpa everything I'd found. He listened silently, then finally said, "Let her have her vote. We'll be ready." I spent those 10 days like a woman possessed, cross-referencing every document, time-stamping every email, building a binder an inch thick. My attorney friend agreed to represent Grandpa pro bono once she saw the evidence. "This isn't just winnable," she said. "This is a slam dunk." Word spread through Millbrook that something was brewing. Neighbors who'd been silent for years started quietly reaching out. Mr. Osei knocked on our door one evening, holding his own shoebox of citations from years past. "I kept these too," he said, "just in case." Turned out I wasn't the only one who never trusted Deborah's smile. I just might have been the only one brave enough to act. 2 more families came forward, sharing stories of pressure campaigns, fabricated violations, and quiet threats that pushed them to sell cheap. A pattern of harassment against multiple residents made our case exponentially stronger. This wasn't one dispute, it was a scheme. The night before the emergency vote, Deborah posted on the community Facebook group, painting Grandpa as a difficult, entitled resident. The comments turned ugly fast, some neighbors piling on without knowing the truth. the way mobs online always do. I almost responded. My attorney friend stopped me. "Save it for court," she said. "Let her keep talking. Rope, meet neck." The morning of the vote, the community clubhouse was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Folding chairs lined against the walls. Deborah walked in wearing a blazer sharp enough to cut glass, radiating the confidence of a woman who'd never lost anything in her life. She opened with a speech about protecting community standards and difficult residents who refused to cooperate. Grandpa sat beside me, calm as a lake at dawn, his weathered hands folded like he was simply waiting out a storm. When it was our turn to speak, my attorney friend stood instead of Grandpa, and Deborah's smile flickered for just a second. "Before this board votes on foreclosure," she began, "I'd like to submit evidence regarding the validity of this lien." She placed the county deed on the podium. The one proving the fence line and the encroachment had always belonged to Grandpa. Whispers rippled through the room. Deborah's confident posture stiffened, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. Then came the email, the one where she told her husband to keep pressure on the old man to fold and sell. The room went dead silent. Even the board members, Deborah's own allies, exchanged uneasy glances at each other. "That email is private correspondence," Deborah snapped, but her voice cracked on the last word, betraying her. "It was submitted through a lawful public records request tied to HOA business conducted on HOA email," my attorney replied evenly. Twist: the private email had been sent from Deborah's official HOA account, making it fully subject to disclosure under state law. Deborah's husband, sitting in the back row, suddenly found something very interesting to look at on his phone. The board president, visibly rattled, called for a 10-minute recess. Deborah stormed out to the parking lot, phone pressed to her ear. I followed at a distance, close enough to hear fragments. "They have the email." "No, I don't know how." When the meeting resumed, the vote on foreclosure failed 6-1, with Deborah casting the lone vote in her own favor. But this wasn't over. A failed vote didn't erase a filed lien, and Deborah wasn't the type to surrender quietly. 2 days later, she filed an actual foreclosure lawsuit in county court, using outside legal counsel, her husband's firm, unsurprisingly. She was escalating from committee politics to real litigation, betting that Grandpa couldn't afford a real courtroom fight. She'd bet wrong. My attorney friend, it turned out, had spent 3 years litigating exactly this kind of HOA fraud case. "She just made the biggest mistake of her life," my friend said, smiling for the first time since this whole ordeal began. "We filed a countersuit. Fraud, harassment, and violation of state HOA statutes governing pre-existing agricultural land. The local paper caught wind of it. Local HOA president sued over farmland dispute, and suddenly Millbrook wasn't so quiet anymore. Deborah tried damage control, giving a smiling interview about misunderstandings and community harmony. But the deed didn't lie. More residents came forward after the article ran, each one adding another citation, another threat, another piece to the puzzle. Twist: one former board member, forced out by Deborah 2 years prior, reached out with board meeting recordings she'd secretly kept. Those recordings captured Deborah explicitly discussing motivating holdout residents near the highway corridor to sell. It wasn't circumventional anymore. It was Deborah, in her own voice, describing a coordinated pressure campaign for personal profit. My attorney filed for an emergency injunction, freezing the lien and halting any foreclosure action until the fraud claims were resolved. The judge granted it within a week. Deborah's plan, months in the making, had just hit a wall built from her own words. Grandpa, watching the injunction get approved, finally let himself smile the way he hadn't in months. "Never bet against a farmer," he said. Deborah wasn't finished. Cornered people, especially controlling ones, tend to get more dangerous, not less. She tried a new angle, claiming Grandpa's goats posed a public health hazard, filing a complaint with county animal control. The inspector who showed up took one look at the well-kept pen, laughed, and told Deborah her complaint was baseless and a waste of county time. Twist: that same inspector had dealt with Deborah before. She'd filed similar false complaints against the Chapmans before they moved away. County records now showed a documented pattern spanning multiple departments. HOA, animal control, and code enforcement, all weaponized by one woman. My binder had grown into 3 binders. What started as a shoebox of citations was now a mountain of undeniable evidence. The court date for the fraud case was set for 6 weeks out. Deborah's husband's firm requested 3 separate delays. Each delay bought us more time to dig, and every week we dug, we found something new buried under Deborah's polished exterior. We discovered she wasn't even licensed to practice law in our state, despite regularly threatening residents with "my legal team." Twist: my legal team was, in reality, just her husband and one overworked paralegal operating out of a strip mall office. The illusion of power Deborah had built over 2 years was cracking, piece by piece, under the weight of documented truth. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact with us now waved, some even stopping by to thank Grandpa for finally standing up to her. Mr. Osei organized an informal meeting of affected residents, all agreeing to testify if the case ever reached open court. What Deborah thought was an isolated old farmer was actually the tip of an iceberg she never saw building beneath her. A week before trial, Deborah's own board members quietly voted to remove her as HOA president, citing loss of confidence. She fought the removal too, filing an appeal within the HOA's own bylaws, the same bylaws she'd weaponized against everyone else. Poetic justice has a way of finding people who live by loopholes. This time, the loophole worked against her. The bylaw appeal failed on a technicality she herself had inserted years earlier to block challenges to board decisions. Twist: Deborah was hoisted by her own petard, undone by the exact clause she wrote to make herself untouchable. By the time trial arrived, Deborah was no longer HOA president, no longer untouchable, and no longer confident walking into that courtroom. The morning of the trial, I sat beside Grandpa in the front row, his old suit pressed, his hands steady for the first time in months. Deborah arrived with her husband and a lawyer who looked like he hadn't slept in days, sensing the ship was already sinking. My attorney friend opened with the county deed, then the fabricated lien, then the "keep pressure on him" email, laid out like dominoes. Each piece of evidence landed harder than the last, the courtroom shifting from curiosity to quiet outrage. Grandpa testified simply, without theatrics, describing 30 years of farming land his family had owned since before Millbrook existed. "I never asked for trouble," he said. "I just wanted to grow my tomatoes and keep my goats. She wouldn't let me." Deborah's lawyer tried to paint Grandpa as combative, uncooperative, difficult. The judge wasn't buying the performance. Then came the former board members' recordings, played aloud in open court, Deborah's own voice discussing motivating holdouts. Twist: the recording also revealed Deborah had personally profited through a shell company tied to the developer's land acquisition bonuses. The courtroom gasped audibly. This was never about aesthetics or bylaws. It was a real estate kickback scheme disguised as community governance. Deborah's face, usually composed and smug, went pale as her own words condemned her in front of a packed courtroom. Her lawyer requested a recess. The judge denied it, stating the evidence spoke clearly enough to proceed without delay. One by one, the other affected residents took the stand, describing the exact same pattern of manufactured citations and pressure tactics. The Chapmans, who'd moved 2 states away, drove 12 hours just to testify against the woman who'd forced them out. Each testimony chipped away at the last of Deborah's credibility, until there was nothing left standing but the truth. The judge ruled swiftly. The lien was fraudulent, void from inception, and the foreclosure case dismissed with prejudice. But the ruling didn't stop there. The judge referred the case to the district attorney for potential criminal fraud charges. Deborah's husband's development firm was named in a separate civil suit filed jointly by every affected Millbrook family. Twist: the developer, wanting no part of a fraud scandal, immediately severed all ties with Holloway and Cross, leaving Deborah exposed alone. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, and for once, Deborah had no polished statement, no smug smile, nothing to say at all. Grandpa walked past her without a word. Though I caught the faintest nod from him, an old man's quiet version of victory. Within a month, Deborah was formally charged with filing a fraudulent lien and multiple counts of harassment under state HOA statutes. Her real estate license, the one she'd used to intimidate half the neighborhood, was suspended pending investigation. The HOA board, under new leadership, issued a formal apology to Grandpa and reversed every fabricated citation on record. They also refunded every fine Grandpa had paid, with interest, and a written admission of wrongful enforcement. Twist. It turned out several board members had known about Deborah's scheme for months but stayed silent out of fear of her retaliation. Once she lost her grip on power, those same members came forward too, eager to distance themselves from what she'd done. Deborah eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced fraud charge, avoiding prison but accepting a felony record, fines, and 5 years probation. She and her husband sold their house in Millbrook within weeks, the very neighborhood she'd once ruled like a queen. Nobody threw them a goodbye party. A few neighbors, including Mr. Osei, watched the moving truck pull away in silence. Grandpa's farm was fully cleared of every claim, the county deed reaffirmed, his land untouched and entirely his own again. The goats stayed. The tomatoes kept growing. The flag went up again every 4th of July, exactly as it always had. But the fight had cost him something too: months of stress, a scare with his blood pressure, sleepless nights he never fully talked about. "I got my farm back," he told me one evening on the porch. "But I don't think I got back the years this took off me. That was the cost nobody put in the court records. The quiet toll of fighting for what should have never been questioned at all." Still, when I asked if it was worth it, he didn't hesitate. "Every single day, Casey. Every single day." Millbrook elected new HOA leadership the following spring, people who actually read the bylaws to help residents, not trap them. I stayed on the farm longer than I'd planned, finding a kind of peace in dirt and sunrise I hadn't expected after my divorce. Grandpa framed the county deed and hung it in the hallway, right next to a photo of Grandma, like a reminder of everything worth protecting. Sometimes I still see Deborah's name pop up online, in some other town, trying to run for some other board, and I just shake my head. Some people never learn, but some old farmers and their stubborn granddaughters never stop watching either.